If you could please find your seats, that would be great. Thank you. Look how everyone got quiet so quickly. Okay, welcome everyone to the first Santa Fe Livability Speaker Series session of 2025. Yes, thank you. This session is entitled Unlocking the City, How Zoning Shapes Santa Fe's Future. My name is Veronica Toledo, and I serve as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at HomeWise. At HomeWise, we work to help people get ahead through home ownership. We do this by making a pretty chaotic and intimidating process simple and accessible through free financial education and coaching, salaried realtors, down payment assistance, and affordable mortgages. Over the last 30 years, we've helped over 7,000 individuals and families make their dream of home ownership a reality. Thank you. We just wrapped the first Livability Speaker Series program in Albuquerque for the first time ever. And this is our third year running the program here in Santa Fe, which we are thrilled to be doing. This series is really designed to help residents and decision makers learn from local and national leaders about the role of land use in making our cities affordable or not affordable and livable. Tonight, we'll be focusing on the role of zoning, which we thought was particularly important during this time, as the City of Santa Fe is updating its land development code and general plan, and Santa Fe County is also updating its sustainable land development code. Before I get a chance to bring our speaker on stage, I would like to take a moment to thank our incredible sponsors that made this evening possible. Our Livability luminary sponsor, the Santa Fe Housing Action Coalition. Our affordability ally sponsors, the La Fonda Foundation, the Santa Fe Chamber of Commerce, and Santa Fe Habitat for Humanity. Our sustainability steward sponsor, Christus St. Vincent, and our Friends of the Series sponsor, Friends of Architecture Santa Fe. Let's give them all a round of applause. Thank you. We'd also like to thank our amazing partners that helped us develop this series. These include many of those we've already named, as well as the Santa Fe Watershed Association, Santa Fe Area Home Builders Association, Midtown Arts and Design Alliance, Santa Fe MPO, Urban Land Institute, Mass Design Group, Chainbreaker, YouthWorks, and Evan Ripley Architect. Round of applause. Lastly, a few logistics. So you can use the QR code on the screen to view the program for this evening. It also includes all of the speaker bios. After our speaker concludes, we'll have a panel discussion and some time for Q&A. Like always, we accept questions electronically via Slido throughout the evening. So to participate, please use the QR code on the screen, or you can go to slido.com and input the number shown. Once you're in Slido, you can click Q&A and the green Ask button to submit your questions. We are so pleased to launch the Livability series with Sara Bronin this evening. A little bit about Sara. Sara C. Bronin is a Mexican-American architect, attorney, George Washington University professor, and policymaker whose interdisciplinary work focuses on how law and policy can foster more equitable, sustainable, well-designed, and connected places. She wrote Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World, and she founded and leads the National Zoning Atlas, which is digitizing, demystifying, and democratizing information about zoning in the United States. She also served in a presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed role chairing the Federal Historic Preservation Agency. Please join me in welcoming Sara Bronin.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you to HomeWise. What an excellent organization, and we should give them one more round of applause because the work they do is so meaningful. So I am so grateful to be here in Santa Fe. This is actually my first time visiting this amazing city, layered with so much history, history of European settlers and others, but also a tribal history. And I've really appreciated over the last couple of days, really getting to know the place to the extent a visitor can. And although I prepared my presentation beforehand, I hope to get a chance to talk about some of that over the course of the Q&A. So today I'm talking about zoning, and the title of this talk, they titled it Unlocking the City, but I think that's a great title. Zoning is so important in so many different ways to not just Santa Fe, not just the region, but so many places around the country, and it really is my life's work to try to help people understand how land use laws shape our world. Not just how we live and where housing is located, but a really wide array of issues. So again, housing affordability, housing accessibility is something that zoning, which you probably know, local laws that dictate how development can happen, regulating land uses, structures, and lots. So a lot of people talk about zoning and housing, and in fact, that is what I'll be focusing on today. But this slide is meant to tell you and just to ping that zoning affects so much more. It affects how and whether we can respond to climate change, because zoning has huge impacts on how we develop our cities, our suburbs, our rural areas, how much we drive. So of course, zoning does affect our transportation patterns, how often we use a car, whether transportation, public transportation is viable. It affects things that are much deeper. It actually affects how we relate to each other, whether we can develop the social bonds with each other through the communities and their built forms that can either foster or deter that kind of community engagement. Similarly, economic growth, environment, I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about some of the zoning particulars, but zoning is a huge engine for economic growth in some cases, a huge barrier for economic growth in others. And then finally, a topic that I'll just touch on in a few minutes, very briefly tonight, but is one of my favorite topics because it's so underexplored, the links between zoning, which tells us where we can grow food and how we can grow food, whether we can have bees and hens and those kinds of things in our communities. It truly does affect our food supply. And for people who care about food like I do, I love great food, but local food, and I know that's really big here in Santa Fe. So I do encourage you, especially this audience, to think about zoning and food. So again, overall, this talk is really about understanding how zoning works and understanding why it's important. So Veronica and HomeWise asked me to talk about two different topics today. The first is the book, and I'll be signing afterwards, so please feel free to pick up a copy if any of this ends up interesting you. But the second is a project that I've been involved with that Veronica mentioned called the National Zoning Atlas. And if you have your mobile device, you can go to zoningatlas.org and queue that up for that part of the talk if you're interested. But these are the sort of two topics of today. So I'm going to start with the book, and I really want to talk about why I wrote this book. I know there's a couple of you in the room who have read it, but what it really is it is an explanation of how zoning works by using stories from different parts of the country. Unfortunately, no place in New Mexico is in the book, but the next version will have lots. But stories, not data, and trying to talk about how individual people harness zoning to do something good in their communities. And this actually is where I'm from. Does anybody recognize this particular highway? I had a distinctive bridge here. This is the city of Houston, which is where I was born and where I grew up. You may know, or you may not know, but the city of Houston is the only large American city without zoning. So if you have been to Houston in your life, you probably recognize that it is this 500 square mile large place that actually keeps growing because it keeps annexing land, and it doesn't exercise zoning at all. So what that means is that a lot of Houston relies on driving. There's a lot of sprawl. But it also means that different uses can pop up next to each other. So where I grew up in a neighborhood called Gulfton, right across the street from my childhood home was a strip mall, a nightclub, now El Príncipe Azul is the name of the nightclub, a self-storage facility, a gas station, all the kinds of land uses that you probably don't want necessarily right across the street from an apartment building with lots of families in it. That kind of development happens in Houston, though, pretty commonly. And I mentioned another couple of examples in my book, including an adult shop that had long been located in the parking lot of the fanciest mall in Houston called the Galleria. But Houston did influence the way I think about cities because I spent a lot of time in the car, and I also spent a lot of time looking around and thinking, this could be better. And that's part of the reason I went to architecture school. Houston might have been this thing that motivated me as a child, not that I knew anything about zoning at the time, but that motivated me as a child to think about how we build. But it was really in Hartford, Connecticut, the capital city, where I really got to know how zoning works in the real world. So for about 10 years, I had been a law professor, and I was fortunate to be appointed to the Planning and Zoning Commission of the city of Hartford. And of course, I'd written about zoning, I probably knew all the zoning cases, and a little rusty on some of those now. But being appointed to a Planning and Zoning Commission really helped me understand how important zoning was to that community. Hartford is a post-industrial city. It's a low-income city. It's a city that has a whole lot of beautiful historic architecture, very different in feel, of course, from Santa Fe, but layers of history just the same. State Capitol as well, that's the picture in the middle. And you can see an image from Bushnell Park on your top left, an Frederick Law Olmsted designed park, and some of the cast iron buildings on Asylum Street. These images are just meant to give you a sense of how Hartford looks. It was there that I understood how deeply the zoning code affected so many aspects of people's well-being, including not just their housing needs and housing security, but also transportation security, food security, and actually quality of life and happiness in general. It turned out that in Hartford in the 1950s, the city had adopted a zoning code that was really suited for suburban development. It was suited towards cars, to be honest. There were a lot of places where those gas stations and car washes were allowed. There were no restrictions whatsoever on one-story setback strip malls. You would never see that in downtown Santa Fe, but you certainly saw that springing up in and around Hartford. The book actually starts with a tour that I took early in my tenure as chair of the city's Planning and Zoning Commission with this woman, Denise Best, a neighborhood leader in a neighborhood within Hartford that is about 97% Black and very low income and has some of the highest obesity and asthma and other respiratory disease and other health and heart-related disease in the entire state. And so how did it get to the point where this was the case in this neighborhood called Upper Albany? Well, right behind her, we were just a few months ago on her porch on Deerfield Avenue. Right behind her, you can see this thoroughfare with colored buildings in the back called Albany Avenue. And the zoning for Albany Avenue, it turned out, had changed in the 1950s to completely decimate what was once a very beautiful avenue filled with 3- and 4-story buildings into an avenue that served primarily suburban commuters in the wealthy white suburbs west of Hartford, people who were going into Hartford's downtown and to their jobs and then racing back. So along Albany Avenue, instead of the 3- and 4-story buildings like the ones you saw in my first image of Hartford, you now saw more like this. So this building in the foreground, the brick building, is what the avenue used to look like but it had changed over the last maybe 50, 60 years to become this very hostile, very car-oriented place, cutting right through her neighborhood. So if you ask, why are there high asthma rates? Well, because Albany Avenue, again, was a thoroughfare for cars, 35, 40 mile per hour speed limits, because actually this is after the street improvement, but before that, the road was even wider, more dangerous, some of the highest pedestrian casualty rates and bicycle casualty rates in the state. And zoning had played a really critical role. When I walked with her that day, and it was in July many years ago, I realized that she had been working in her neighborhood for many years, but she never really linked zoning with what had happened to her neighborhood. And in particular, we visited a Popeyes fast food restaurant with huge curb cuts, absolutely no trees. The trees had been totally removed from Albany Avenue, and a pedestrian's nightmare. But we walked by it, and actually starting from her house, you could smell the Popeyes, and you could see trash and wrappers from the Popeyes. And that was one of the very few restaurants that was available to her because it was a drive-through restaurant that fit the formula, given the number of cars that passed and given the fact that there were no rules in Hartford on a development like that. So together with Denise and many other people around Hartford, neighborhood leaders, we really started to get a sense of how zoning had gone terribly awry and tried to fix it. So Hartford does appear a lot in the book, and I'll talk a little bit more about Hartford and what we did there now. So one of the first things we realized is that even though Hartford had a lot of parking lots and vacant development sites, very little housing was being developed in the city. In part, that was because we made approvals in the most attractive part of the city, the downtown, almost impossible. There were public hearing requirements, there were height caps, there were parking mandates that all but eliminated but the largest lots in downtown for development. And so one of the things that we did in a new code that we adopted in 2016 was to make all housing as of right, meaning that any number of units up to certain modest height caps, certain reasonable height caps, I should say, it goes up to 38 stories downtown, but we made all of those approvals as of right. That is a big change for most cities. We might be one of the only large cities that has done that. 125,000 people, okay, it's not enormous, but it's sizable. But that was a really big change that has, since we passed the code, enabled hundreds, maybe thousands, I think at this point, of units to be built. Here's an example of units that were built in a largely Latino community not too far from my house in Hartford that had been sat vacant for maybe 30 years. We also became one of the first, or one of the major cities to implement a very robust urban agriculture program. And I really care a lot about urban agriculture, not just because I love food, but because I was educated by the Food Advisory Policy Commission for the city, which included representatives from many nonprofits, local leaders, people who wanted to connect our population to healthy food options within their neighborhood. And one of the places that I talk about in the book is this site here, the Keeney Park Sustainability Project site. It's an urban farm that is located on city-owned land that had previously been illegal under the zoning code, which banned, like many, at least New England codes, all kinds of urban agriculture. So in addition to legalizing urban farms with single owners, we also legalized community gardens, which is one owner but many farmers, farmers markets, keeping of hens, the keeping of bees, and we use the city of Boston and other cities as examples for provisions on things like fencing and composting and the pathways for bees, try to get all of the best practices into our code. To me, this was really important because many, especially New England cities, had long had an agricultural tradition. The Boston Common, a great example, where sheep grazed for hundreds of years. And we sort of decided at some point through zoning and through city ordinances that these things were nuisances and they should all be banned. But for our community, which actually is a lot of West Indians, as well as Puerto Rican and people who have had that experience from their communities, they bring that to Hartford. We're actually a significant immigrant population as well. Unlocking that, I think, has helped at least maintain a bit more autonomy and food security. I do want to talk, too, a little bit about parking mandates, and now I'm going into the weeds here on the technical side. But parking mandates, essentially requirements that developments have a certain amount of parking, are so important because what they do is they constrain the use that is being built because you have to put parking spaces on the lot. So for example, if this farmer's market was being built in most American cities today, you'd not only have to have this farmer's market, but you'd have to have a massive garage that related to the amount of square feet within the farmer's market. In most American cities today, for every apartment unit, you need 2 parking spaces. So if you start doing the math, parking spaces in a structured facility are $50,000, $75,000, maybe $100,000 per space. Who bears the cost of that? And how does it limit the housing in particular that can be built on a site? If you have a smaller site, parking could eat up the whole site. It could make development infeasible. And it is a huge problem for developers. It's a costly problem, and the costs get passed on to renters. So I don't think they're necessary. If a developer thinks they'll need parking to rent a unit, you bet they will build it. But we've sort of incorporated some of these arbitrary features into zoning codes all over the country. It's just something that planners decided to do, and now we are seeing cities start to undo that. So I do recommend the Parking Reform Network for the latest on cities that have achieved these goals. This is Hartford. So my house is in the red block. It is one of the oldest brownstones. It's right on Bushnell Plaza, which is that green at the top of the image. My children have grown up completely surrounded by parking lots. They're not super happy about that, but we do have the park, which is beautiful. In my book, I talk about the park and the charter oak and the benefits of trees. So if you're interested in zoning and landscape, I recommend that particular chapter. But the importance of trees in a city. And you can see really no trees in any of these places. So parking lots and the urge for us to think, okay, we've got to find a space for every single car we've ever created. It has negative effects, not just on the aesthetics of a place, but certainly on the environment. This is just essentially sheets of water runoff that go into the streets. And again, no shade, urban heat island effect, and no amenities for the people who live there, including my children. So just to reiterate, zoning has these rules, and whether it's parking mandates affecting the way that we move around the city, whether it's the bans that many cities have on things that can make us healthy, connections to nature, connections to food, or whether it's probably what many of you are here today to think about, housing security. Zoning has huge impacts. I always, though, bring in food and transportation because housing security is just one piece of a household's well-being, right? So it is all of these other pieces. Access to health care as well is one of those, and that comes from a solid transportation network. So again, in Hartford, we redid our zoning regulations. Of course, we had a lot of community involvement. Those are some of my fellow planning and zoning commissioners there, the great group representative of every neighborhood in the city, and I recruited every single one of them actually along the way, along my 7 years there. So that was a fun exercise for me, but also I think a really good exercise for the city. Some people ask, okay, well, you had all this community involvement in the zoning code, one of the largest processes in the city, largely run by the commissioners, not by a consultant, run by us. We went out to people, we engaged them, we met with them. It was very rare that we had public hearings where they had to come to us, or public meetings where they had to come to us. But they ask us, well, what has happened since? And as I point out in the book, we actually have amended our zoning code, at least when I was there, a dozen times since we passed it, because it was a complete overhaul. We knew we wouldn't get it right, and that's why we were flexible and open to change. So it was a constant process, and I think the main thing that I learned was that you cannot be scared about the change. You kind of have to rip off the Band-Aid, and if there are consequences that have different, on the ground applications, those things will surface pretty quickly. And instead of making a developer come to us on a parcel by parcel basis, we heard some issues and we sort of made 10, 15, 20 little edits at a time where the commission was leading the change. And we said, okay, here's how these things fit together. This is what we've learned as of now. Let's move this forward. Let's keep changing it until we get it right. In that way, we also help the property owners within our city, many of whom did not have access to lawyers and some of the things that many large developers do, but yet were affected by the code. So I'm happy to talk more about process. I focused on Hartford tonight really to give us a focal point, but the book is definitely not just about Hartford. So I do talk much more about Houston and why Houston tells me that we do need zoning. We have a human impulse to order our land. Zoning is probably the tool to do it, but zoning needs to change so that it's actually better. San Diego, Scottsdale, and Tucson here in the Southwest, and the differences between those on water, and I'll show you a slide in a moment. Chicago, Nashville, and Galveston, which is pictured here, the East End neighborhood. Has anybody been to the East End of Galveston? Okay, so we love this. I love this historic neighborhood. And historic preservation embedded in zoning codes is something that I'm happy to talk a little bit more about, as well as form-based codes. And the book isn't just about housing. Housing is one chapter in the book, but it was really important to me to illuminate all of these other aspects of zoning that are so important. So whether it's craftsman industrial uses like the Colt factory in Hartford, which was being converted to a brewery. One of the things that actually prompted us to change the zoning code one of those dozen times, whether it's artists who are making their own live workspaces in neighborhoods. There's a whole chapter on nightlife. So I feature my somewhat nerdy, very rare that I go to nightlife, college days in Austin. But comparing Austin, Nashville, the Baltimore red light district, transit, of course, and urban farming I've talked about, water hogs, and here's a picture of Taliesin West in Scottsdale, and you'll notice it has a green lawn. And for many years, Scottsdale had a zoning requirement that the lawns have to be green. Whereas Tucson has a zoning requirement. I'm sure you've been out there, so maybe you haven't, but if you haven't, Tucson has the requirement that landscaping be xeriscaped, so it's rocks and sand and cacti. And the difference in water usage between those two cities was really stark. And a lot of it had to do with irrigation of lawns, and that was something that was embedded in the zoning code. So here are the table of contents. Again, love to talk more about all of these different cities. Maybe we'll get a chance in the Q&A. But the range here is all of zoning. And there's stuff that religious uses in college towns that I didn't touch on in the book. Again, maybe there will be a part two, because zoning is endlessly fascinating to me. So with that, I'm just going to turn for a few minutes to the second thing that they asked me to talk about, which is a project called the National Zoning Atlas. And here is just a cover image of it, so you hopefully recognize where we are in that image. If you want to pull it up on your phone to explore later, it's at zoningatlas.org. And now this is a really different project than the book. This project is focused on housing. And our aim is to read every zoning code in the country. And essentially what we try to do is we try to say, what does zoning codes say about housing? Where is single family allowed? Where is multifamily allowed? And take all of this information and spit it back out into a format good for data nerds, good for people who love maps, but it is much more fine-grained than the stories that I offer in the book. So our aim is to digitize, demystify, and democratize information about zoning. And by democratize, I think that's a really important part of it. Zoning codes are really inaccessible. They're really hard to read. If you ever picked up Santa Fe's zoning code, it's probably perfect to many people, but it might also be just as hard to read as zoning codes all over the country. And we know this because we've read thousands of zoning codes. I have not digitized all of them, but I have read and verified thousands at this point. We've completed 11 states, the states that you see on this map, including New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado. It looks like we've completed Texas, but we're actually only just over 55% done there. Texas has a lot of little jurisdictions. New Mexico is actually pretty straightforward at 140 jurisdictions. Arizona has 106. Texas has 1,500. Just to give you a sense, it's not as bad as, I think North Dakota has 2,200, so does Ohio. Minnesota has 2,000. So these are difficult problems. There are about 33,000 zoning jurisdictions in the country. That means 33,000 cities, towns, and counties typically that exercise zoning. So we've published over 7,500 jurisdictions to the map. So if you did see something colored in gray, by the way, which doesn't have zoning, and purple, which does have zoning, and it's not always clear when jurisdictions don't have zoning. It's like you have to prove the absence of something by calling the town assessor, the town clerk, and so on. So interestingly, and I'll show you some stats in a moment, New Mexico has a significant amount of land that's not zoned, and that's even outside the protected lands and tribal lands, which are excluded. Anyway, 800,000 pages of zoning codes, 81,000 zoning districts. And we've covered about half the population and half of the acreage in the country. So just looking at the atlas, I just wanted to show you a few slides from it. So this is what pulls up when you get to the screen. You can zoom to the state of New Mexico. This is what you see. Again, the contrast between Arizona and New Mexico is quite striking. I'd love to learn more about the history, why there's so much zoning in Arizona, why there's not so much in New Mexico. Only 2 of those 106 jurisdictions in Arizona do not have zoning. In New Mexico, there are 77 jurisdictions that have zoning, only 8,000 pages of zoning codes. This is one of the lightest zoning code to jurisdiction ratio. You think I'm joking. Most of the zoning codes are 180 pages. So this is not too bad. This is just over 100 pages. And we log about 200 different regulatory characteristics for each zoning district. Here's what we found in New Mexico. So 55% of the jurisdictions have zoning. That's a 77 out of 140. There's a lot of, so the 2 greens in the middle, for those who can't see in the back, are tribal and protected lands. A lot of land is tribal and unprotected. A big chunk of land is unzoned. So only 13% of the land within New Mexico boundaries, excluding public rights of way, is unzoned. Just for the zoned land, the vast majority of it is zoned this medium purple, which is residential. So whether that's single-family housing or suburban-style development, a lot of that could be agricultural and residential. So by land mass, that makes sense, right? Because a lot of the zoned areas will have agricultural uses as well. There's a small amount we call mixed with residential, meaning residential and other uses. You see very different statistics in some states. Nevada, for example, which we've also completed, has a much bigger percentage of non-residential land. It's only 2% here, and a much bigger percentage of that mixed with residential land. So they'll mix airports and housing and industry and housing. We've seen places that have mobile homes and industrial uses only in their zoning. Just let that sink in. Anyway, statewide, this is what we see for that residential land. So both mix and so the 98% that allows residential. The vast majority of the land in New Mexico allows for single-family housing. There's actually, this is very striking, a significant portion of land in New Mexico, and that's that graphic all the way on the right, that allows for 4-family housing. This is a really big contrast with New England states. So the categories are 1-family, 2-family, 3-family, 4-family, and the dark blue is what you're looking for, because that's housing that is allowed without a public hearing. For us, it's really important to log that difference in process because of the fact that when you have a public hearing, it almost certainly means that the housing will not get built, or it's extremely difficult to build. So we really value and look at that as of right figure. So just by contrast, in Massachusetts, where we just finished the zoning atlas, we saw about 3.5% of land allows for 4 or more family housing as of right. So you're doing pretty well in New Mexico on that measure, in that there's a lot of land that allows that. Here's where it was surprising to us, where your pace in terms of land that has parking mandates for residential is just as high as New England states. So you got to ask yourself, we're out in, like, a lot of these places are less populated. Why are they having parking mandates, right? I mean, and so what is that? That seems to be something that we could tackle pretty easily. In less populated areas and less dense areas, it seems unnecessary. And in historic neighborhoods, it also seems unnecessary. Parking mandates have often resulted in the destruction of historic buildings, which I care about a lot. In terms of accessory dwelling units, so do people know what these are? These are the small units of housing that you can typically build on single-family land. Statewide, New Mexico is also doing pretty well. So 32% of land bans ADUs, but the rest of the land actually allows them. So this is better than some states, worse than some states, but there's a pretty good chunk, almost a third of land, that allows them by right. This might be a policy issue that the legislature could take up, because we've seen ADU allowed state statutes in other states, and that has not resulted in widespread destruction of cities and suburbs and rural areas. It's an easy, low-hanging fruit win. Actually, in California, I know nobody wants to be like California, but they have the most progressive ADU laws, and ADUs actually have become one of the top building permits that people are asking for in city after city when it comes to residential development. You can develop all of these snapshots yourself on our website, zoningatlas.org/snapshots. You can create the charts that I just showed for any city, region, metro area, county, or the full state in New Mexico. So I encourage you to visit that page. You can use these snapshots yourself and send them to your local officials. Speaking of Santa Fe and our snapshots here, we do see in Santa Fe, that's the image on the left. I'm looking at it behind, so I'm pretty sure it's your left. It's just Santa Fe. So you actually see in Santa Fe, there are different restrictions on the multifamily housing, but the basic log is that a lot of it is allowed as of right. On the right is Santa Fe County, so the 3 jurisdictions within that are included in the Santa Fe metro area, and you can see the difference in 2 and 3 family, likely because a lot of the land outside of Santa Fe itself it's more land outside of the city. So here's that statistic a little bit clearer. And then here's New Mexico. So this is the regional snapshot. So do you see at the top where it says metro area snapshot? So now you can see that particular slide a little bit clearer. 7% of land in the Santa Fe metro area allows 2 family. And again, here's the statewide snapshot a little clearer, where you have, I love this. This is great. The train, I saw it between Albuquerque and Santa Fe yesterday. So keep it up, rail runner. But this shows you how, maybe this area is a little bit more restrictive than the state as a whole. Parking mandates too, and you see this is a metro snapshot, are higher here than the state as a whole. So again, what's the deal with the parking mandates? There's a lot of land with parking mandates here. New Mexico is still a lot, 89%. I'll just close by talking briefly about how the National Zoning Atlas has been used in other states. This is the first event where anybody from my team of 28 full-time staff members is talking about the New Mexico Zoning Atlas. So you are the first group to really see some of these stats. We just cleaned up our zoning snapshots. So that's going to be a really good tool for advocacy. But I'll just point out a few examples, and you can see more on our website at /impact if you want. But in the advocacy department, our zoning map has led to change. The one big example of that is in Montana, where a libertarian think tank helped to build the first part of the Montana Zoning Atlas, and they used that to lobby for the biggest statewide zoning reforms that had ever hit Montana. So if you've heard of the Montana Miracle, they did an op-ed in the Washington Post about it as well. That is an example of a success story. Of course, my other example is the success that we had with the first zoning atlas in Connecticut. But I'm told I can't always use Connecticut. So Connecticut also resulted in statewide changes just a few months after the Connecticut zoning atlas, the first one to be completed, was built. We also see people have used this in their own cities and towns. They send us information about how they've used it, how they've used the snapshots too. We've also conducted analysis, our own team members have conducted analysis of the information we've collected. And New Mexico featured in one of the recent reports that our analysts did for zoning practice. And in that article, it was called Eliminating Map to Text Discrepancies. So that's kind of a wonky way of saying the zoning text and the zoning maps do not match in many jurisdictions. So you'll have zoning codes that say a district exists, but it's not on the map. But more importantly, you'll have a map that says that here's where this district is, and it's not mentioned in the zoning code. Or you'll have different sub-districts on the map that are also not mentioned in the zoning code, or are mentioned, you might say sub-area A, B, C in one place, and the text says sub-area green, red, and yellow, and you're like, what is, so our analysts have to call jurisdictions, and sometimes a planner will be nonchalant and say, well, everybody knows what this means. In other cases, the planner doesn't know what the map is supposed to say. So our map, and by the way, our analysts in the jurisdictions they looked at calculated that 35% of jurisdictions had what they categorize as a major discrepancy between the text and map. And this is, we didn't call any jurisdictions out. Maybe the New Mexico jurisdictions, again, were totally perfect, and they were in the 65%. But they did New Mexico and about 4 other states, because they were 2 analysts that worked across a lot of states. So just flagging, our research through our project is showing how convoluted zoning is and how difficult it is for people to understand. If you can't even cross-reference these 2 things within a single jurisdiction, how do we expect to understand how zoning really works in our world? And so just the last thing I'll mention is that the Zoning Atlas is also unlocking very wide-scale research. So let's see, what do we put here? Okay, we put our Regional Plan Association report that we co-authored with this 100-year-old tri-state that's over in our part of the world, New England, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut nonprofit planning organization. And our inquiry was, where is zoning in Long Island, in Westchester County, and New York City putting housing where it shouldn't, because sea level rise is coming? And so you've seen Superstorm Sandy, you've seen maybe the stories about Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty being subject to sea level rise, lower Manhattan. It's coming, it's there, everybody knows it's happening. But yet the zoning codes are still putting housing development in places where that's inevitable. So what we asked was, how much do communities, including wealthy communities in Long Island and Westchester, need to rezone their higher ground areas to allow more housing, both to accommodate the same amount of population and to account for existing housing deficits? And it was hundreds of thousands of units that zoning needs to zone for. So again, our analysis is unlocking analysis like that. We've also done reports with the Urban Institute in Mobile, Alabama, as well as Connecticut, finding high rates of zoning and exclusionary zoning with racial and economic segregation. Okay, you might say, no duh, right? Okay, but our data is now showing exactly how and where that happens. And I'm really proud of that secondary research, because what it is going to do is it's going to hopefully create an inevitable amount of, or maybe an inevitability for zoning reform, because sort of the facts don't lie. We're just reading codes and putting it on the map. Sometimes we get it wrong. We make corrections all the time when we've reinterpreted something or interpreted something incorrectly. But to the extent that we can do these reports, we're going to keep doing them, and we're mostly right. If you want to connect with us, these are our websites, our social media. There's my couple of things as well. I encourage you to, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation today. So thank you so much for having me. Should I sit here?
That was terrific. Thank you so much, Sara. So grateful. We are going to move into some discussion with Sara, and I'm also joined by Heather Lamboy, who is the director of the City of Santa Fe's Planning and Land Use Department, and Alexandra Ladd, who is the director of Santa Fe County's Growth Management Department. Thank you both so much for being here. Yes, thank you. Please. I'm going to start with a few questions, and then we will take audience questions again through Slido. So the link is up here on the screen, so feel free to use that throughout this time if you'd like to submit more questions. Sara, in your book, you talk about how public hearings often happen too late in the development process, after a developer or property owner has already invested a lot of time and money into the project. And you talked tonight about how you eliminated public hearings on multi-unit projects in Hartford. Would love to hear about how can we bring the public into the conversation earlier, more thoughtfully, more effectively around development?
You know, I really believe in public engagement. We did more engagement in Hartford, more conversations in my federal agency role, in the historic preservation world, another topic, than had ever been done before in any of those contexts. But it really is a question of when that public engagement is appropriate. If we want to see housing built, in particular, studies have shown, I have personally witnessed, that every time a project gets a public hearing, the people who show up are people who do not want the project, people who are existing residents who don't understand necessarily, not because they are bad or stupid, but because the overriding rhetoric about new housing is that this is going to bring crime, it's going to bring the wrong kind of people. Students are going to flood the school systems, often in places where schools are shrinking, and then people are saying, where did my school go? Well, you didn't let anybody in who had children, who are not a problem, by the way. Children are good for every place. So I think the question is the time. And for us in Hartford, I can just speak to that experience and say the development of a form-based code, a code that would show people really the kinds of buildings that would be built in their neighborhoods, was critical to unlocking that comfort level with the lack of public hearings for each and every new building. So we could say the builder is going to pick from this menu of options. It's shown right here. Here are images in the city that show you how it's going to be built. A lot of them, the historic buildings. And again, our form-based code actually harkens back to Hartford from 100 years ago, what could be built. Again, more so in downtown, lots of different variety there. But in the neighborhoods, a lot of it is infill like there is now. Infill, like in Denise Best's neighborhood, was there 100 years ago, got obliterated by parking mandates and a bad zoning code, a 1950s era zoning code. That was really key. And I know you guys are thinking about that here, and lots of communities around the country are thinking about expanding and are doing that as well. So that's one thing that I would say was a winning strategy for us, because it gave people certainty about what they would see.
Thanks. Heather, Alexandra, would love to hear from you too about how you're thinking about this at the city and county level.
So with the reference to the city level, we do have sort of a unique type of process where we have an early neighborhood notification meeting. Is it perfect? No, it's not, because you have an applicant present their case, and then there's feedback, but it's just sort of on the fly. It's not doing well enough in terms of engaging the public on a deeper level. So we've been looking at the possibility of helping out with our digital platform, getting the word out about proposed applications. We are updating our land development code, and there's a lot to be done when it comes to the public engagement, but there's a lot to be done when we need to think about administrative approvals. It's not to say that anything is being hidden. The applicant can be, the public can be notified, but those administrative approvals go a long way towards allowing for housing to be constructed in a faster way. Time is money, and that's a big issue.
So one of the things that you talked about, Sarah, that really struck me was this idea of sending planning commissioners out into the community to do the public engagement work. Like, I want to hear more about that, because I'm just, wow. Because I think we do get, and the county also has a pre-application meeting with the community. Again, only the people who hate the thought of anything changing are going to show up, and it's not the most productive feedback always. So I think we could make improvements there. But I think the very structure of the process is not favoring the voices who are not usually heard. It's favoring the people who have the ability to speak English and can drive a car to the meeting and don't mind paying for parking and can handle the timing of the meeting because they don't have 3 jobs or kids to take care of. So, one of the things that the county has instituted that is not perfect, but I do think that it has some promise. The county will recognize a group as a community organization. They have to be geographically connected to, generally, they're the traditional communities or historic areas. And they're afforded rights under our land use code where they can actually be, they get extra notification further ahead of time, but they can also be parties of standing during a public hearing. Here's the catch, none of them really understood that. So we have these community planners who are doing their best to notify the community organizations. The community organizations, we got in trouble because our code says mail everything by snail mail. They're saying, we don't go to the post office anymore, why didn't you email us? And so there's adjustments you're making on the fly. But we're working our community planning team to really kind of go out of their way to ensure that those community members who can be ambassadors for good development, and they've also participated hopefully in a planning process that's resulted, in a community plan that is then translated into an overlay zone. So that's sort of engaging the community in a more sort of practical way.
Yeah, and I'll just speak, if it's okay, since you asked about, or since you commented about some of the things I said. One thing I didn't say, and I think maybe this is part of the issue, is that the people who serve on planning commissions are not representative of their communities, period, across any community in the country. And I show the image of my fellow commissioners in Hartford because, and you maybe can't tell because you don't necessarily want to judge by people's images, but Hartford is an 85% Black and Latino city. And when I showed up in the commission, it did not look that way at all. And part of my recruitment effort was to say, you have 2 young kids under age 5. You're a renter, and looking at that composition so that when people showed up to our meetings, they really saw the community that they were in. There were meetings that I held in Spanish. Melvin Colon, my fellow commissioner, we were both asking the applicant things in Spanish, and the other commissioners were like, what's going on? And we're like, you don't need to know. We'll tell you, we'll translate all this later, right? Like we need to do is show the applicant, like we understand what you're talking about. They don't roll in necessarily with all the skills that a professional planner does. That's one thing I wanted to say. And in Connecticut, as was done in Massachusetts, we just released a survey of land use commissioners. They're white, wealthy, male homeowners, mostly. Not in Hartford, but mostly across the state. They're not renters. They're not young people, older, I should say older, they're not representative. And that is part of the reason why you see some of the outcomes that you do and see the snail mail, because your commissioners could fix that, or your county executives could probably fix that pretty quickly. But again, it's not representative. So part of what the public has to push for is for the mayor, the city council, whoever is electing the advisors, and the city council members themselves to really understand the full range of issues. And even at some point to write that into the code itself, how commissioners are picked. The second thing I wanted to say, the first thing was that, oh no, I totally lost track of, maybe I'll come back to it. I think I'll have to come back. What was that? Going out into the community. Oh, going out into the community, yes. So the going out into the community part was actually because probably something, maybe not, but something that many communities experience is that the professional planning staff are horribly abused by members of the public. I am shocked. This is really, so clap for them, to support them. But members of the public treat planners very poorly when they are trying to get something done, are trying to use their professional skills, are convening public hearings. They get followed to their cars, they get yelled at. Again, maybe not here, maybe that never happens, but in many communities, and I just heard this, I was just in another community where the planning director was telling me about this, and that there is such a deterrent for people to become city and urban planners. And part of it is that we don't empower those people to make land use decisions that they are well trained to make. That includes the range of administrative approvals. That includes the range of community engagement and public meetings. So we actually went out into the community ourselves because we did not want to subject the planners to the kinds of things. Because it's like, what are you going to yell at us? We're doing this for free. So like what? We came to your meeting. We sat here for an hour until it was our time. Now we're here. So you're going to yell at us? No. So, we kind of were part of the community, and I felt it was really important. And I was at all the meetings, and I always brought as many planning commissioners as wanted to come with me. I think I did maybe 100 meetings myself on the zoning code, in addition to our climate action plan and our city plan. Because I really felt like I and our commissioners were the barrier to that public funnel. And when they saw us out there, it really also helped to give them a focal point for people in their communities to funnel information back and forth. That's not for everybody. Nothing bothers me. People can say all kinds of things to me, and I don't care. I'll just keep kind of being calm and whatever. But so it's not for the faint of heart. But I did feel like it was really important for us because of that dynamic that is off the rails in too many places.
Thank you. I want to shout out, we do have a number of planning commissioners from the city of Santa Fe here, and I think we're getting a lot closer to what Sara is talking about and what happened in Hartford. So thank you to those of you who are serving. I would also encourage you to look at the city website. If you're interested in that, there's often openings for planning commissions and other city advisory groups. So please check those out. Those are great opportunities to really represent the community or wherever you're from, neighborhoods, etc. So encourage that. Let's talk historic preservation. Okay, historic preservation is a cornerstone of Santa Fe's identity, but as the city evolves, we have to find ways to balance preservation with the need for new housing and growth. Sara, as a preservationist with really strong experience at the national level, as a former federally appointed chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation with these state and local roles, would love to hear your perspective on this. Do you see ways to approach preservation beyond district-based rules? So here we have a historic district that has certain design standards and review processes for the entire district. Are there other tools that we could be using to protect our history while also allowing for thoughtful development?
Thank you for that question. And I am totally a preservationist. I love historic buildings. I've served on my local commission, statewide Preservation Connecticut, and chairing the Federal Historic Preservation Agency. So that's a whole other side of things that maybe we'll only touch on with this question. But I really believe that preservation can be a wonderful tool for new housing. And the reason I believe that is because historic preservation has often and historically been a tool for new housing. Creative people engage in historic preservation. bringing new buildings back to life. It is the hardest kind of development because of all of the rules, whether it's environmental remediation or design controls like historic district ordinances, whether it's structural issues and you got to get multiple engineers and a capital stack, use historic tax credits, get all of that in order. It's really, really hard. So I think those preservation developers are amazing and really important. Preservation has, however, gotten a pretty bad rap because of people who use preservation to thwart new housing. And I actually don't think those people are preservationists, because I think preservationists can see, because they are creative people, how those two go hand in hand. So as chair of the Federal Historic Preservation Agency, this became one of my top priorities over the time I was there. We passed a historic preservation and housing policy statement that talked about the need for flexibility, the push for tax credits and other incentives, the need for zoning to actually get out of the way of redeveloping historic properties, including parking mandates, including residential over Main Street offices, something the city of New York finally just did, allowing residential over their sort of neighborhood main streets, and actually huge amounts of development have finally been happening in some neglected corridors, and including just a wider diversity of uses, something I do talk about too in my book. So I think there are tools that zoning can bring, that financial tools can bring, and I'll also just put a plug in for a big initiative that didn't go far, which is the need for us to be more flexible in thinking about the rules, the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties that are often misinterpreted to constrain development. And what I mean by that is these rules were originally written 40 years ago, really broadly, to encourage rehab, but they've been interpreted, whether by local commissions or by federal officials, as really, really strict. Oh, you gotta, like, if this light wasn't here, forget it. Like, this is terrible. But we need to be much more flexible, because that's actually what makes preservation great and what makes spaces great, is layering the new with the old. And I will say, I had the fortune to beam into a Santa Fe Historical Commission event, thanks to Heather, and I know you guys are tackling these questions. The questions that I got there, if anybody was at that event, were brilliant. They were great. I know you guys are thinking about these issues, so kudos to you all for doing that, because it is really important, and I think Santa Fe could be one of those communities that has long had historic preservation controls and really starts to think about how to move beyond just that design review to encourage the rehab of historic places.
Thank you. Heather, Alex, how are you thinking about the future of historic preservation?
My first job out of graduate school was as historic preservation planner for the city of Santa Fe. And preservation is truly about telling the story of a community. I think as we plan for the future and we're working with our community partners to define what that might be with the general plan update, as well as the land development code update, we can look to our past to really help us understand the context. So, approximately in the east side, the density in most of the east side, with the exception of the foothills, is 8 dwelling units per acre. So people realize, oh, well, that's pretty dense, and it looks okay. That's something that we can do in other parts of the city. So it's really telling the story of Santa Fe and understanding how we're evolving and changing. And right now with the Land Development Code update, I'm getting some criticism because we're trying to move toward those Secretary of Interior standards. We started out as a historic styles ordinance, and that was the story that was being told by a lot of archaeologists at the beginning of the 20th century, is we want Santa Fe to remain something unique and special from the rest of the country. And in 1957, that ordinance was adopted and formalized. But we haven't really evolved. We've added preservation standards, but we really need to move forward in thinking about Santa Fe as a living organism, something that can change, that becomes something, it changes its personality, just like the kid that's growing up, There's the base from the family history and all of that, and then just growing up and creating their own histories and seeing the future that way. So historic preservation is criticized oftentimes in the city of Santa Fe, but it accomplishes a lot as well. And the biggest form of recycling is doing some sort of adaptive reuse of building or rehabilitating a structure. A lot of the structures in our historic districts are difficult because of the cost. We tried to implement a program through a grant for Endangered Properties program, and the problem is in Santa Fe, the cost of land is such that the programs through the Habitat for Humanity or other nonprofits that doesn't qualify for those, for that assistance, the financial assistance to families who've been in the historic districts for a long time and might not be able to afford improvements to their homes and maintenance.
Yeah, I think I would add also, we have a lot of lessons to learn from our historic areas. And if you spend any time on the east side of Santa Fe or in the historic districts, you realize there's sort of 3 takeaways. One of them is that if you have high density or high density for us is 8 dwelling units per acre, by the way. We're scared of anything over two stories. But you have to, a couple of other things have to go along with that. So the built environment has to be interesting looking. It has to be varied. You can't just have sort of the same kind of housing. And if you walk around the east side of Santa Fe, there's big houses that used to be chicken coops, falling down fences, big, fancy, beautiful gates. It's just a mishmash almost. But it's interesting. I think the second thing is that you have to be able to move around the space, the high density space, without necessarily being in a car. Same lesson on the east side of Santa Fe. Those roadways were not built for cars, they were built for burro carts and for people who were just trying to figure out how to walk on their 2 feet the quickest way to an area. So they're rambly and weird and narrow, and there's not a lot of parking. So as a pedestrian or someone on a bike, the cars kind of have to get out of your way a little bit. And so it feels safe, and it feels like you can get around. You don't feel too crowded in the high density area. And I think the third thing is proximity. Density for density's sake is no good. You need to be near things. So if you are close enough to parks and places where your kids go to school and where you can shop for groceries, being in that high density environment is very, very livable. But if you're out in the middle of nowhere in a high density environment, that's not so helpful, because guess what? You need a car to get there.
Thank you. Okay, I have one more question, y'all, and then we're going to take audience questions. At least 1 in 3 people who works in Santa Fe lives outside of Santa Fe County. Would love to hear about sort of top 2 to 3 reforms that you're thinking about in the city and the county to increase housing affordability. Rapid fire.
Well, certainly in the Land Development Code, through partnership with HomeWise as well as our technical working group, we're developing incentives for affordable housing to help things pencil. So allowing for more density per dwelling unit, affordable dwelling unit. So that would really help to provide developers the ability to develop affordable housing and also market rate housing, which also makes provision for people not competing for housing, dwelling units, making naturally affordable housing inaccessible. So that's really an important component, also setting the policy framework in the general plan update and through different programs that are sponsored by city councils and governing bodies and county commission. Those things are going to be really important. That whole regulatory framework is key to providing for affordable housing and partnerships. I think partnerships with the public and the private sector really are effective.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're looking at, well, we're not just looking at it, we're doing it, but in the amendment of the county's code is the inclusionary zoning requirement, which requires affordably priced homes, applies to a subdivision. Well, guess what doesn't subdivide? A multifamily property. So we effectively ruled out any affordable apartments in the county. And so, we've got a few things like that we're sort of overlooked and not quite thought through, or maybe just reflected homeownership bias, like who renters, we don't need those, So I think that's one very basic one. I think the other place where affordability in a market sense is very much affected is when the process causes delays and increases costs for developers or uncertainty for developers, and then they're in a position of they have to maximize value just to cover their liability for doing the project. So we're planning lots of improvements that way too.
Would love to take a few audience questions that Sara is going to read for us.
Okay, so the first question, New Mexico has the highest pedestrian fatality rate in the country. How can zoning make active transportation safer?
That is a great question, and I have a whole chapter on street design in my book through zoning. So zoning has not often been used to help design the public rights of way. In Hartford, we have a streets chapter. In my book, we have a streets chapter too, but it regulates how streets can be designed. I almost included in this presentation an image of a subdivision, one of the few that have been built in Hartford. There's 2 of them, with streets that were designed in accordance with the new code, which really follows NACDO principles. And the argument I make in the book is that zoning is a police power. It's about regulation of land uses. Cities typically own the streets. There's a lot of state roads too and federal interstates, but cities own most of their streets. So cities have the power to design them, and it shouldn't be left up to the city engineer. So zoning commissions need to start asserting their authority to design and identify streets that match what's being permitted in those areas. I will say, Santa Fe feels to me, as a pedestrian, extremely dangerous. In the place where I'm staying, which happens to be a place with very narrow roads, very low visibility, no sidewalks. This is a decades, centuries-old problem, probably. So this has nothing to do with our leaders on the stage. This is a sort of mentality shift that would have to take place here, where not only would the city have to invest beyond zoning in new infrastructure, but the zoning code could be a tool that could be used to really push design forward in the public realm beyond just what the city engineers say and what has historically been the case here. Again, decades old issue, it felt to me, but it's very, very unsafe, I have to say.
Heather, Alex, feel free to jump in.
I have to give a shout out to our Public Works Department because they have a complete streets section. And the Complete Streets group is really trying to advance design concepts that aren't like the strict ones we have in our Chapter 14, the Land Development Code, where this is how everything looks, and all streets should look this way based on this, the number of cars that travel that street. And so, yes, we do need flexibility, but the pedestrian should be the first in the consideration of movement. It's difficult to move around downtown Santa Fe, but do people do it every day and do it well? They do. And is it causing huge problems that it probably are an F criteria on the traffic impact study? Well, no, it's not a huge disaster. Now, in bigger communities, maybe that's different, but I think it's really important that we design for the pedestrian first and then for movement of cars.
And I will say that that's not the case in downtown. Downtown did feel very safe. You could see the results of complete streets changes, street closures, reroutings, wider sidewalks. But that wasn't the case necessarily in my run today. So I do want to say that is, I see that happening. I see the investments, and that is a shift that is already underway. Exciting.
Next question, Sara.
How much should state governments preempt local zoning laws to promote affordable housing?
And I took up too much time, y'all, with my question, so that we can get through a few audience questions. If you could keep your responses to like a minute, that would be great. Thank you. Anyone want to jump in?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I guess as the representative of a county government, I don't like that idea very much. I feel like the state government has a role to play in creating a place for convening and resources and technical assistance and best practices. And I almost think that that would be more effective. I mean, we're a rural state, and, we don't really like the state telling us what to do.
And I think it's important to remember that we know Santa Fe. We should control how things look. I think that's really an important component of it. But the state can also help, because there are, especially in the state of New Mexico, there's a lot of land that's owned by the state, and the state can provide opportunities for redevelopment and construction of affordable housing there as well.
I'll just say, in other states, we have seen state preemption of local laws where the state legislature essentially decided that it would be too slow for local governments to adopt changes at scale that would address affordability issues. That was the case in Montana. It's a case in California. It's a case in North Carolina that just did sweeping zoning reforms statewide. And the state legislature, there is always that tension between local governments and the state legislature, but at some point, these state legislatures have hit the tilting point, and that may be, I don't know where New Mexico is right now in that continuum, but that's what has changed in other places where we've seen a lot of state preemption happening.
So aside from this conversation here, have you seen effective strategies for helping residents better understand zoning and see themselves as participants in shaping it, not just as people reacting to proposals? Are there a couple of examples you could recommend for us here?
I would like to offer that one strategy is education. And this forum is a perfect example. When I was a fellow, we had some sessions where we had blocks out on the table. Leah Igney, who is in our office, she helped to coordinate that, and we looked at, well, what are things going to look like? And I think that's the thing we planners have to remember is we might have in our head what a 3-story building is going to look like here because we're familiar with it in the day-to-day, but the community might not be. And so it's really a critical piece is the education and the outreach. We're using our community partners program for the the general plan update. And maybe we can extend that to the land development code update as well. So we actually have those little charrettes and communicate things visually, not just through words and the like.
As many of you know, I will just say we offer the Livable Santa Fe Fellowship Program, which is really designed to help residents do a deeper dive into a lot of the issues that we're talking about this evening, and then really figure out ways to take action and be a part of the changes that are happening in Santa Fe. Just really quickly, can you raise your hand if you are currently part of the fellowship program or have been in the past? Let's give these folks a round of applause. Thank you.
Yeah, I just was going to also, again, refer to the county's community planning program, because I think community planners work with a community for years even to kind of identify what the values of the community are, what the resources that the community wants to protect, and sort of where they want development and what kind of development. And then that community plan, those values are translated into an overlay district. So if you go to the county's land use code, you've codified the community plan, which is actually a form of implementation. But I think it is helpful to kind of see and understand that translation of the process. And I think the folks who participate in the planning and then are part of the overlay code being drafted and approved are getting a little bit of a better understanding of, and honestly, the planners are too, of how the process works.
Okay, let's give our amazing panelists a round of applause. Thank you all. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for joining this evening. We are grateful to have collected works here this evening with copies of Sara's book, Key to the City, available for purchase. And like she said, she'll be signing copies, so I encourage you to visit that table after we conclude. We look forward to seeing you for our next speaker series session, which will take place on August 26th, entitled Bridging the Gap, Missing Middle Housing to Strengthen Santa Fe. This is with architect, urban designer, and author Dan Paralek. He'll explore a spectrum of small-scale, multi-unit housing types that bridge the gap between single-family homes and large apartment complexes, promoting walkable, diverse, and attainable communities, and discuss how those could be better supported here in Santa Fe. You can use the QR code on the screen to register, or you can visit livabilityspeakerseries.com. As a reminder, all of these sessions are recorded and are available at livabilityspeakerseries.com within 2 weeks of the session. In a moment, we are going to break for food, drink, and community building. When you walked in, you received a card with a couple of discussion questions, which are also here on the screen. We encourage you to use these as you chat with people you know and don't know to debrief the session. We hope you have a great evening, and will join us right back here for some free food and drinks. Thank you all so much.